And they're on water only, literally distilled water only, for anywhere from 5 to up to 40 consecutive days. And during that time, some really profound changes occur in the body. And as a 501c3 nonprofit research-based organization, we're in a position to actually research, document, and publish in peer-reviewed journals the results of what we're seeing, which really, as you mentioned, is rather spectacular.
What inspired you to make a focal point of your practice fasting and all the benefits that that entails?
Yeah, I got started really young. I was a 16-year-old frustrated basketball player getting beaten by my best friend Doug Lyle. And I practiced, but I couldn't kind of get ahead of him. So I thought maybe if I got healthier, that might give me an edge and I could crush him. And so I started reading books, and I came across some stuff by Herbert Shelton and others that said that health was the result of healthful living, and that diet and lifestyle factors played an important role. So I adopted a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. And unfortunately, it failed because my friend Doug did the same thing. And to this day, I'm 62 years old playing basketball and still getting crushed because he's just a lot better than I am. So it didn't help me beat him, but it did get me interested in healthful living. I was also inspired by my uncle, who was a physician. And he said that, I remember I was about 16 and I decided I was going to pursue this kind of career. And he said, no, absolutely not. Nobody in this family goes to these alternative type doctors, and nobody certainly becomes one of these alternative doctors. And he said, it would be better if I became a communist spy.
Wow.
And he was absolutely irate. I remember him screaming and yelling. I thought I was going to witness my first stroke right then and there. But anyway, he left, and my dad, who was a pretty serious guy, took me aside. He said, son, I don't know about this alternative medicine business, he says, but anything that makes him that angry and mad, well, it can't be bad, so you stick to your guns. Oh. And he encouraged me, and and I went to chiropractic college in Oregon and then osteopathic college in Australia, and I got a chance to do some work with a guy named Alec Burton, who had decades of experience using medically supervised water-only fasting and helping people get well. And it blew my mind because I watched these people coming in with conditions that I was trained, nothing you can do except give them drugs, they'll be sick forever, that's just how it is, high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, lymphoma, and they got well. And oh man, if this one gets well, I'll really be convinced. I said it like 50 times to myself. And so as I started seeing people get well, I realized that things were a little different than I had been trained and that I had believed. And that the difference seemed to be the people willing to do really dangerous and radical things like, eat well and exercise and go to bed on time and use fasting were actually able to heal themselves from these conditions. They got off their blood pressure meds, they got off their diabetes meds, their blood sugar and blood pressure normalized. I remember calling my uncle and saying, Uncle, I'm seeing these patients with blood pressure consistently getting well. And he says, no, they're not. I said, I'm taking their blood pressures. They're getting well. He says, you don't know how to take blood pressures. I said, no, I know how to take blood pressures. And so when I came back to the United States after training in Australia, my wife, Dr. Morano, and I decided we were going to do this. And so we opened up True North Health Center. This was 1986. And since then, we've had over 20,000 people undergo fasting here. We've had a chance to see a wide variety of conditions get well, and we're publishing those results in peer-reviewed journals. So we're able to demonstrate that fasting can be done safely, it can be efficacious, as long as a reasonable protocol is followed and you do it with the appropriate patients.
That's powerful. Your family sounds like it would be a wonderful sitcom, by the way. But you stated something in your work. You stated that, and this can seem a little unusual, you stated that essentially when you go to see a conventional physician, they often don't expect you to get better. And that's kind of what you were alluding to.
Well, not only that, they guarantee you, if you go in to a conventional doctor, say with high blood pressure, they will say, number one, you will need to take these medications. It might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different medications, depending on how many drugs it takes to bring your pressure down. And they will guarantee you, if you do exactly what you're told, you'll never get well. They'll tell you, you'll be on these drugs, not for a week, not for a month, but for the rest of your life. Because they know these drugs will not get you healthy, but they will try to bring your pressure down and reduce your risk of stroke. It never even dawns on them about getting well. It's not part of the paradigm. at the True North Health Center, we are a residency training site. And so, for example, students will come in as part of their training. They spend a month rotation at the clinic. And the most common comment from the medical interns is, wow, I've never seen somebody with blood pressure get well before. Or I've never seen somebody with diabetes get well before. This is the first, because it's not part of the paradigm. The paradigm is you manage these symptoms with drugs, you pay the price, the chronic cough, fatigue, the impotence, the premature death, and that's just accepted as a consequence because nobody gets well. This is an alternative approach. This is considered very radical, and radical comes from the word radicus, or root or cause, because you're dealing with the root or cause, the reason why people got high blood pressure. And it's largely because of what people put in their mouth. So when you change the cause, you get rid of the problem. Now, granted, there's a downside. You have to keep eating a healthy diet, and you have to keep exercising, you have to keep getting enough sleep, you have to avoid the things that cause the problem. But that's more than what most people want to take on. Most people want to keep doing the things that cause their problem, but take a pill, potion, or powder, and then pretend like that's going to get them healthier.
Right. These are all things that you just listed. These are things that our genes expect us to do. You know, our DNA expects us to provide these environmental inputs. And what you're just sharing is that a lot of these drugs, they're not really treating the underlying condition. They're treating the consequences of not doing those things. Is that right?
Right. It's like we spend billions and billions of dollars treating the leading causes of death in the United States: heart disease, cancer, and stroke. What we don't do is spend a lot of money treating the actual causes of death, the reason people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke. We give them a greasy, fatty, processed food diet. They get obese, they develop metabolic syndrome, then they are at increased risk of dying from heart disease, cancer, stroke, and even infectious diseases like COVID-19. If you look today, like who's vulnerable to dying from infectious diseases, one of the major risk factors is metabolic syndrome, increased blood pressure, blood sugar levels, blood lipid levels, etc. So the idea being that the same diet that makes you vulnerable to dying from heart disease is the same diet that makes you vulnerable from dying from some forms of cancer and autoimmune diseases and even infectious disease.
It's so true.
So unless we're prepared to make those dietary and lifestyle changes, get rid of the drinking of the alcohol, the use of the tobacco, and the use of the chemicals that are added to food that make us fat, sick, and miserable, the salt, the sugar, the oil, then we're not going to be able to get rid of the actual causes of disease, and we'll be stuck treating the leading causes of death.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. From my knowledge, I'm the first person that I'm aware of to really just go and actually stay on top of the CDC site, because it's right there on the site itself. The most updated data, and this is just from a couple weeks ago, found that 94% of the folks who lost their lives in association with COVID-19 had an average of 3.8, and we'll put the link for everybody in the show notes, 3.8 pre-existing chronic diseases and or comorbidities. It's insane. It's just, how are we even walking around so sick in the first place? Wow.
Yeah, it's very frustrating because the paradigm is off, and so that means behavioral changes are difficult to induce. You know, people aren't thinking about getting well, they're thinking about how do you get your symptoms to go away. And even with weight loss, you know, most programs fail miserably at reducing all-cause mortality. Even procedures like surgical procedures, gastric bypass, where they may be able to average a 50-pound weight reduction, it still doesn't reduce all-cause mortality substantially, because you're still not dealing with the reason why people are overweight and developing the diseases of dietary excess. They used to call those the diseases of kings, because it was only the wealthy elite kings that could develop the cardiac artery disease and the diabetes or the gout. You know, these were conditions that were rare. Now they're ubiquitous, because even people of limited means in modern society are eating highly processed foods that in the past would have only been available to the wealthy elite.
Yeah, we're all royalty now, in a sense, and maybe the joker, maybe the jester. So I want to talk to you. Really, this is why I'm so excited, and I mentioned this, you know, in my clinical practice, as well as just from some of the great teachers that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years, utilizing this tool of fasting. And we've done different episodes talking with some of the experts, you know, especially in the vein of intermittent fasting. But today I want to talk about and provide this tool, because this could be transformative, even life-saving for folks who really do need it. And you're somebody who is really arguably the top person in the world when we're talking about medically supervised water fasting. So can you talk about exactly what does that mean? What does that constitute, and why it's so effective?
So, definition of fasting is the complete abstinence of all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. And, this resting business, as we can discuss, is really important because one of the goals of fasting is to give the body a chance to mobilize and eliminate those accumulated intermediary products that have built up inside the cells and inside the body that are thought to contribute to compromising health. And so there's actually two kinds of fasting that people do that are common right now. One is intermittent fasting, which you mentioned, which is essentially, for example, limiting the feeding window. In other words, what we do at our clinic and with our patients is we feed them in an 8-hour feeding window when they're eating. And they have a 16-hour period of fasting. So that means they're not eating 3 or 4 hours before they go to bed. We might delay breakfast a little bit from what's traditional. And so that means they eat within that 8 hours. Or if you have people that perhaps need a higher caloric intake, maybe they're feeding in a 12-hour window. But the idea is even that 12 to 16 hours of fasting, just that brief amount of time is cumulatively thought to induce changes in the body that are associated with healing, increasing autophagy, reducing insulin resistance, etc. So that little bit of fasting every day that almost everybody can do safely, because it doesn't require withdrawal medications, it doesn't require radical supervision, may be a good long-term benefit. And there's lots of research by Walter Longo and others, both in animal studies and now in human studies, showing that there's some benefit to limiting the feeding window and using intermittent fasting. He also recommends periods of time during the month where maybe you would limit your calorie intake to 750 or 800 calories, maybe using whether it's his products or whether it's food restriction. But the idea is to facilitate weight loss and reduce some of this dietary excess issues. What we do that's unique is long-term water-only fasting, actual fasting, not fasting mimicking programs, but actual fasting. And those periods of time will range anywhere from 5 to 40 days. So when they're undergoing fasting at the True North Health Center, first of all, let's be clear, it's people that have been medically screened. We've reviewed their medical history, done a physical exam, and established baseline laboratory data, so we know they're good candidates for fasting. And then they're in an inpatient setting, in our case, the True North Health Center, where they're being seen twice a day by staff doctors, and they're being evaluated, both blood, urine, and physical examination finding by doctors experienced in long-term fasting. And they're on water only, literally distilled water only, for anywhere from 5 to up to 40 consecutive days. And during that time, some really profound changes occur in the body. And as a 501c3 nonprofit research-based organization, we're in a position to actually research, document, and publish in peer-reviewed journals the results of what we're seeing, which really, as you mentioned, is rather spectacular. We mentioned blood pressure. We did a study on high blood pressure where we took 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure. And of those 174 patients, 174 people were able to lower their pressure enough to eliminate the need for medication. And for those that are willing to stick to a health-promoting diet, they can sustain those results indefinitely. We have the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating high blood pressure, with an average effect size of 60 points in stage 3 hypertension, people with systolic blood pressures that start at 180 or higher. So these people are able to normalize their blood pressure, and if they adopt a whole plant food SOS-free diet, they can sustain those blood pressures, eliminate the drugs that cause the chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and premature death, and overcome that problem, a problem that usually is considered to be irreversible, but manageable with drugs.
That's incredible. I really hope that everybody's ears are perking up because, again, you just mentioned high blood pressure, hypertension. It's one of those things just consider like you got it. It's in your genes.
We say the same thing with type 2 diabetes, another condition of dietary excess, where they're making enough insulin, but the insulin's not working because of insulin resistance, to where they're having to use medications to try to force the glucose into the cells. When glucose can't get from the bloodstream into the cells where it's needed to be burned as fuel, blood sugar levels go up. That's what diabetes mellitus is inability of insulin to do its job. Well, fasting reduces insulin resistance. And so it allows most type 2 diabetics to achieve normal blood sugar levels without the need for the insulin or the metformin or the other medications. And that's huge. And we'll see hemoglobin A1Cs where they're 14, 16, and with diet and lifestyle change and fasting end up 5 and sustainable. Again, they got to do the diet, the sleep, the exercise, because you have to maintain healthful living in order to maintain the problem. So fasting's not like a magic cure. It's just a way to create an environment to give the body a chance to do what it does best, and that's heal itself if you get out of the way.
So what is the underlying mechanism that enables fasting to be so effective? Is it because food requires so much energy? Does that have play a part?
Well, actually, we know there's a number of mechanisms by which fasting works, and one of them certainly is weight loss. I mean, anything you do that facilitates healthful weight loss may be potentially beneficial, and obviously nothing works better than fasting. I mean, if you fast, you lose an average of a pound a day. So people do on fast lose a lot of weight. That's certainly at least part of the beneficial effect. There's also a natriuretic effect that occurs where the body selectively eliminates sodium and flushes it out. And most people are eating these high salt diets that allow them to hold lots of extra fluid in order to protect yourself from that toxic effect of excess sodium. And so that excess fluid volume increases your blood pressure. And so when you natriurese or diurese, what happens is the body gets rid of the excess fluid, the blood volume goes down, the blood pressure starts to drop, the non-healing wounds start to heal, the congestive heart failure starts to reverse. And we also see primary detoxification in fasting. That was kind of the traditional justification for fasting. This idea that the body had toxins in it. And in fact, we know now if you take a fat biopsy of just about anybody in society, you'll find hundreds of different chemicals. Dioxin, PCB, pesticide residues, heavy metals, all kinds of exogenous toxins. There's also endogenous materials, not necessarily toxins, but things like cholesterol and lipofuscin and creoid and all kinds of things that are maybe normal products, but when they're in abnormal quantity, they may interfere with cellular function. And the body in fasting rapidly mobilizes and eliminates these toxins. In fact, some people argue does it so rapidly it might be dangerous unless you take their proprietary products. Then, of course, I guess it's perfectly safe. There's also the idea that fasting, much like exercise, induces enzymatic changes. When a competitive athlete works out every day, they get better and better at mobilizing glycogen in their glycogen stores and storing more glycogen. And so that glycogenolysis process is driven by enzymes. And so when you exercise and you force glycogenolysis, you get better at it. You canalize these pathways. Well, fasting does the same thing. When you go on a fast, you canalize glycogen mobilization, and after 48 hours, you've used up your glycogen. Then you canalize lipolysis, fat mobilizing enzyme pathways, and gluconeogenesis, protein mobilizing pathways. And when you induce these pathways, it turns out that persists. So it's not just while you're fasting that you detoxify and mobilize macronutrients more efficiently, but even after fasting, those enzyme pathways persist, much like exercise and athletics, those enzyme systems persist. And so you're inducing macronutrient mobilizing enzyme pathways, which are also mobilizing detoxifying pathways. And so that process of detoxifying gets more and more efficient, maybe a little bit with intermittent fasting and certainly a whole lot with long-term fasting. And so the idea is that the body not just gets rid of the fat, but also a lot of the materials that are stored in that fat, lowering the total body load. We also see problems with gut leakage in people where the intestinal mucosa, fine filter membranes, can become inflamed when exposed to free radicals and leak materials that in genetically vulnerable people stimulates the immune system to attack those particles, but also their own tissues. I mean, that's what autoimmune disease is, where your immune system is attacking your own body. So ulcerative colitis, where your immune system is actually responsible for the inflammation in your colon. And one of the theories is that gut leakage, the constant exposure to these aberrant proteins or bacteria, etc., can lead to this autoimmune response. Well, fasting allows the inflammatory process to profoundly reduce. We know that because if you look at acute phase reactive proteins or other measures of inflammation in the body, it progressively comes down in fasting. We're showing that in the research that we're doing right now. And we see it clinically because these issues heal up. The joint pain goes down. You're getting them off the prednisone, off the methotrexate, out of pain. And then if you feed a whole plant food SOS-free diet, you can actually sustain those results. And so we know that this process of healing the gut leakage appears in fasting. Some of the metabolic products that show up that are aberrant in the urine go away after fasting, which is a sign that micro mesh membrane, the intestinal mucosa, is actually healing. And of course, you got to get rid of the free radicals that caused it to get. That's why you can't drink, because drinking alcohol bathes the body in free radicals. That's why you get cirrhosis of the liver, which is essentially scar tissue, including from wine, even if it's organic. Alcohol itself is a nasty, toxic substance that, from our viewpoint, needs to be eliminated. Same thing with heated fats, particularly heated animal fats at high temperature. Lots of free radicals. The best example is actually smoking. You know, think about people that smoke. They get smoker's face. They get that premature aging. That's wrinkles are cross-linked collagen tissues that come from the free radicals from bathing the body with smoking. So you first get rid of the free radicals, but then you've got to heal up the gut. And one way to heal up the gut is to do, well, nothing. Fasting. It does it on its own. It does it automatically, and it does it more efficiently, we found, than it does with the pills, potions, and powders and all the stuff that everybody's trying to sell everybody. This is a very ancient practice that gives the body a chance to very rapidly both detoxify, normalize some of these factors. There's even, think about psychospiritual issues. Almost every religion, the Jews, the Jains, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Christians, everybody, they might kill each other in the street over disagreements, but they have one thing they all agree on, and that's that fasting is a very important process, both for mental and psychological and spiritual purposes. Fasting changes the way people feel about themselves and the world around them. It happens automatically. You can't help it. And so that may be why all these major religions have respect for fasting. And all we've done is take this ancient practice and begin to investigate it scientifically to understand how it is it has such a profound effect on people. Fasting stimulates the immune systems, a process called autophagy. And in fact, in 2016, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was given to a gentleman from Japan that did some fabulous research showing how autophagy is how the body kills cancer cells and reverses these toxicity issues. And fasting accentuates this process of autophagy. And I think one of the biggest things with fasting that we've identified is changes in taste adaptation. We did a study where we detected minimum threshold to salt, to sugar, and we showed that after fasting, the actual taste perceptions change in people to where the foods they used to crave, aren't even that appealing anymore. It's too salty, it's too sweet. They don't need that artificial stimulation that comes from the chemicals that we're adding to food. And the hedonic response, the liking of various types of food changes with fasting. So now people will like the taste of fresh fruit and vegetables that maybe they didn't like before, but now post-fasting they find actually they're very enjoyable. The same process happens over time with careful feeding. If you eat well for a month, you neuroadapt to a low-salt diet. But to get people to eat well for a month is hard when the food is tasteless, disgusting, swill to them because they're addicted to the pleasure trap. So helping escape the pleasure trap may be one of the most powerful tools of fasting because it gives the body a chance to, it's like taking a computer that's got a corrupted hard drive and you reboot it, and now all of a sudden, you don't know why, but it works well. It's working again. And we find the same thing is true with fasting, and we're trying to figure out the why with the research we're doing at True North Health.
I love this. I haven't shared this with you, but what you're describing is exactly what happened to me. I didn't eat a salad in my entire life until I was 25 years old. This is the first time I ate a salad. I have no idea how I made it that far, but already I'd made some changes. I was eating less processed food, all this kind of stuff. But just my ability, my palate, I remember a couple months prior, my mother-in-law, who's just one of my greatest teachers, she made this wonderful salad, and she made this dressing from scratch. It's called, we call it Asante Sana dressing, which means thank you in Swahili. But it was like made from almond butter. It's just wonderful. And I took a bite, and I immediately went to the trash can because I was like heaving, And I implemented a fast. It was a couple of weeks. And I went to get a salad. It was the first meal after, which we're going to talk about progressing back to eating food again.
Yeah, very important.
And I went and I sat down at Whole Foods and had a salad by myself off in a corner somewhere. And I took the first bite and I was scared. I was just like, definitely going to throw up. And I took a bite and my brain was like, this is so good. And I was still scared. I took the next bite. I was like, nah, it's just a fluke. I took the next bite. It's like, this is so good. I ate that salad and I walked out of there and somebody's walking by and I was just like, I just ate a salad. And they looked at me like I was from another planet, like, okay, So literally, and I just today I was looking at some of this data from University of Buffalo, and they're trying to kind of pinpoint what's making this palate change take place. And it's apparently our bodies are so amazing, but one of those things is a change in the proteins that we're producing in combination, in correlation with the foods that we're eating. It's just changing the association our body has with these things. So powerful.
You also have, think about the effect on the microbiome. You have 5 pounds of bacteria living in your intestinal tract right now. And those creatures are living creatures that are eating and drinking and actually defecating inside you right now. You have 5 pounds, a trillion creatures pooing in your intestinal tract right now. And what they poo in you could be really nasty toxic waste like TMA, which becomes trimethylamine oxidase, and maybe why meat eaters get so much more colon cancer and die from heart disease at a faster rate than plant-based eaters do. Because meat eaters have a different microflora than plant eaters do, and so they have different poo. What your bacteria poo inside you depends on what you feed them. If you feed them meat, you get a certain byproduct. If you feed them soluble fibers, you get a completely different, you get vitamin K in fertilizer. So one of the goals we do is to try to feed people in a way that promotes a healthy microbiome. And that means not taking antibiotics and doing things that kind of wipe out the flora, and then feeding them to create an environment in the intestinal tract that favors healthy bacteria. And that's one of the things fasting does. It provides a profound rebooting of this microbiome. In fact, we've done a study with Washington University that where we looked at stool before and after fasting on follow-up, and they're analyzing that data right now. There's interesting people. I mentioned Walter Longo, who's kind of one of my heroes, who's done some fabulous research and published in major impact journals like the Journal of Metabolism in 2015. And they showed tremendous things that go down and tremendous things that go up when people do fasting, even short-term fasting. And of course, these factors are profoundly enhanced with long-term fasting. So the benefits that we're seeing with short-term fasting are very exciting, and they're maybe even more profound when you get people to go for weeks, or sometimes even several weeks, on water only.
Yeah.
Obviously some things like glucose and insulin are profoundly affected. Why do we care about that? Well, not only correcting diabetes, but some of the cravings people get and the binge eating they do and the problems they have regulating weight is in part because they're eating a lot of refined carbohydrates, which drive their insulin up, which then drives sugar down, and the brain thinks that they're starving, and so they're craving more food. And so it's very difficult to get stable apostatic mechanisms working when people's blood sugars and insulin levels are bouncing all over the place. Well, in fasting, you normalize glucose and insulin levels. It's a huge difference. That's why over 80% of our type 2 diabetics are able to achieve normal blood sugar levels without medications. And they've got things like insulin growth factor 1. And the lower your IGF-1 is lower your death rate is, essentially. And so lowering IGF happens with 2 things we know about. One is exercise, and the other is fasting. And you're going to hear this theme over and over again, because the same things that get benefited by exercise also get benefited by fasting. And that's not intuitively obvious, because you say, well, why would exercise, where you're vigorously active, and fasting, where we say you have to rest, induce the same metabolic changes in the body, the same neurochemical changes? Well, it's because I believe that fasting and exercise both have one thing in common. They're undoing the consequence of dietary excess. And so the benefits we see with exercise, we've taken a look at those biomarkers, and you look at them in fasting, and lo and behold, time and time again, you see the same things happen with both types of intervention. Leptin levels. Leptin levels go down with fasting, and lower leptin levels are associated with lower inflammation. There's nothing I've seen that's more powerful at reducing systemic inflammation than water-only fasting. And that's why the diseases associated with inflammation seem to respond. High blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, some forms of cancer, all seem to have an inflammation association. And that may be one of the mechanisms by which fasting is helping. We already mentioned blood pressure, heart rate, even things like mTOR. They've identified mammalian target of rapamycin, that the lower the mTOR levels are associated with increased autophagy. And fasting and exercise apparently can lower mTOR levels. We know that the inflammatory markers, the IL-6, the TNF-alpha, all these sophisticated biomarkers, they all go down with fasting during this fasting process. In fact, that's why a lot of the drug companies are interested in fasting. Fasting used to be considered criminal quackery, outrageous behavior. At one point I had to have a criminal defense attorney represent me because fasting was considered so outrageous. Now we've gone from being criminal quacks to cutting edge researchers, because major research centers are looking at fasting, in part because We know now that fasting can augment the effect even of things like chemotherapy. Longo's done some studies showing that you take rats with cancer and you give them enough chemotherapy to kill all the cancer cells and the rats all die. But if you take the same rats with the same cancer but use intermittent fasting, the rats survive, dramatically enhancing cancer-free survival. And once pharmaceutical companies realized that fasting may augment traditional treatments, then all of a sudden there was some interest. And that's now there's, because what they're trying to do is come up with what are called fasting mimicking drugs.
Right.
So drugs that would induce the changes that fasting does in the body, but without that nasty fasting, without having to give up your greasy, fatty, slimy processed foods. You just take the pill, and then you get all these biochemical changes that I've been mentioning. To date, there is no drug that does that, by the way. The only thing that we know that does it is diet, exercise, and fasting.
And on that note of processed foods, by the way, I'd love for you to make this distinction because, we've got listeners who are doing lots of different types of whole food diets, whether it's paleo diet to a vegan diet to raw food diet and everything in between, and making the distinction because a lot of people talk about not eating as much processed foods, but processed meats as well versus whole meats.
Right. Well, yeah, there's clearly, if you're going to be using animal products, you don't want to use highly processed animal food products. You don't want the little nuggets and you don't want the dairy products that are full of oil and salt and sugar, what I call coagulated cow pus in the form of cheese. And these products, highly detrimental, highly allergenic, not foods that we use in feeding our patients before, during, or after fasting. In the case of plant-based foods, vegan foods, for example, may not have animal foods, but they can be highly health compromising, particularly if you're using the chemicals that are added to food that make people fat, sick, and miserable. And that's why we talk about an SOS-free diet. SOS is the international symbol of danger, but it also stands for the chemicals added to food: salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not foods. They're highly processed food byproducts that are added back to food to stimulate dopamine in the brain, and that's what leads to the overeating and the obesity. If you take the salt, oil, and sugar out of food, you get rid of most of the foods that make people fat, sick, and miserable. For example, people say, well, oil, okay, at 9 calories per gram, highly concentrated. When it's fractionated oil, even olive oil or oils that are somewhat less bad than other oils, they're still lend themselves to dietary excess in terms of obesity. Like McDougall says, the fat you eat's the fat you wear. If you do a fat biopsy, you can actually tell what kind of fat people have been eating just by how it's stored. And that's pretty well accepted that lower fat diets may have some benefits in terms of reversing coronary artery disease. Ornish has published a bunch of data that's very interesting there. The sugar, most people on both sides of the dietary arguments, whether it be plant-based or animal-based, agree sugar and refined carbohydrates create a lot of problems. You shouldn't be doing a lot of that. Contributes everything from tooth decay to obesity to immune suppression, changes in microbiome, etc. The one thing that we get a lot of flack about is actually salt, because people realize sodium is an essential nutrient without which you die. And it turns out, just like you get all the fat you need from whole plant foods, you also get all the sugar or carbohydrates you'd need from whole plant foods. You also get all the salt you need. And adding salt to the diet also contributes to obesity and problems. And you say, well, how could that be? Salt has no calories. It's a mineral. Why would eating a lot of salt contribute to obesity? And it's because salt stimulates what's called passive overeating. So if you just eat your full to reach satiety, say of rice, you'd eat a certain amount of brown rice and then you'd feel full, or potatoes, or whatever it is. But if you take that same person, everything else being equal, salt that up a lot, you'll eat more before you feel satisfied. And people say, well, yeah, because it tastes better. You salt it up, it tastes better, you eat more. And that's exactly right. It tastes better. What tasting better means is more dopamine stimulation in the brain. But more isn't necessarily better when it comes to the drug-like effect of these chemicals on food. And that's why people will eat more of the foods than they should be eating or would be eating in a natural setting, because they've taken basically a highly concentrated substance that used to be so rare they used it as money. It was a precious commodity until we learned how to process foods. And so the bottom line is, salt, oil, and sugar, when they're added to food, result in systematic overeating. They result in obesity. They alter the gut microbiome. They suppress the immune system. And if you eliminate those, you get rid of a lot of the problems that we have today with dietary excess.
Yeah,
that is essentially the issue. And it's true whether you're using animal food or not using animal food. If you're eating highly processed plant foods or highly processed animal foods, you're going to be struggling with obesity and diseases of excess. Now, can people eat animal foods? Certainly. You're designed to be able to digest both plant and animal foods. The problem today is the animal foods that are available to us may not be the same animal foods that might have been available to our ancient ancestors, and the quantity that we're being exposed to may be a problem. In other words, it's just like you can eat, too much of anything, too much water, I guess they call it drowning. I mean, anything can be done to excess, but some foods, like animal foods, lend themselves to overeating easier than, say, plant foods with their high fiber content that provide normal satiety. So what we advocate for our patients before fasting, after fasting, is a whole food diet. So whole plant foods, so fruits, vegetables, non-glutinous grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, but not processed, juiced, blended, taken down into a more concentrated form, but in a whole form. And if you do that, the tendency to overeat is dramatically reduced. So we tend to not have as much problem with obesity, dietary excess, blood sugar dyscrasias, etc. And the same principle would be true to animal foods. If you ate whole animal foods without salt, oil, and sugar and all the processing, you'd have much less tendency to overeat, and you'd have much less consequences from dietary excess. My viewpoint, the less the better.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is a lot of these things are coming together in one source. Like upwards of 80% of the salt people are consuming is from processed foods. So just by pulling out that piece, you automatically skyrocket your potential and your benefits. And I want to circle back because this point is so, in our paradigm, it can seem so counterintuitive, and there's some nuance here. But I want to talk about, you mentioned that 5 to 40 days of fasting, for example. So I want you to answer two questions. So number one, what's the longest fast that's been recorded? And number two, if we're talking a couple of weeks, if we're talking 40 days, are we not getting into a place of starvation? What's the difference between fasting and starvation?
So that's a very, very important question. And fasting is when you have labile reserves that you still have that you can mobilize. Starvation is the moment you've depleted your labile reserves and you begin to break down vital tissues. Now, fasting results in improved health. Starvation results in death. So we don't do starvation at True North Health Center because obviously it would damage our outcome data tremendously. We're really proud of our safety data. We've had 20,000 people walk in and 20,000 people walk out, and we're trying to keep it that way. And the way you do that is avoiding starvation. And the way we do that is we establish baselines, monitor people twice a day. Lots of signs and symptoms that we can monitor to measure that, from electrolyte levels to even looking at basic things like BMI. So the average 70 kilogram male, though, just a healthy male, has enough reserves in their body to fast about 70 days. So we're not even getting close to starvation in our patient population. Now, a very, very thin person wouldn't necessarily be able to fast 40 days. They may not have the reserves to be able to safely do that. Also, I might mention that weight loss in fasting is very rapid at first and in overweight patients, but in thinner people, weight loss is much slower. The body's conservation mechanisms kick in. And so weight loss can be as little as 2 pounds a week, deep into the fast. So it's different than early in fasting where people are diuresing and losing fluid and all that. Now, one thing I want to point out, though, is we are the first place I know that has done this, but we have a DEXA scanner with the new software that does whole body composition. And so we've actually been able to go through and do a study where we are able to show exactly what happens to the fat, the protein, and specifically visceral fat during water-only fasting. And what we found is that not only is fat preferentially mobilized during fasting and protein conserved if you're resting, but that visceral fat is preferentially mobilized. So you might lose 20%, a person might lose 20% of their adipose tissue, but they may lose 50% of their visceral fat and only a small percentage of their lean tissue. And then after fasting, so what happens in fasting is you lose a bunch of weight. After fasting, you regain weight. But the way you regain after fasting is water, fiber, glycogen, and protein, not fat. The fat keeps going down. And so what happens is you've lost a bunch of fat, you keep losing fat, but you regain your muscle, your fluid, your fiber, and your glycogen. And it used to be they thought, well, you lose weight, you gain it back, not a good thing. Now we know if rest is introduced in fasting, it minimizes protein mobilization and minimizes gluconeogenesis. If you're too active when you're fasting, what you end up doing is burning protein. And that's why we insist on a restful state. Now, we let them stretch and do yoga and avoid the pathology of bed rest, but that's not a time to be trying to maximize weight loss. You're trying to maximize fat loss. And so the mistake a lot of people do on their own when they're trying to do weight loss regimes is they're doing vigorous exercise in conjunction with fasting. And yeah, they're losing weight, but they're also depleting protein stores unnecessarily. And so that's a really important issue. And we have a paper coming out. People that are interested in that, we have a fasting website called Fsting.org, which is a fasting compendium website where it brings the world's literature on fasting together. And they can go on there, and as the papers are published, we release it onto that site. And they'll be able to see this, but it's really exciting because we've got really exciting, and we've also got follow-up data now, because we've taken these people before, during, and after fasting, and then during refeeding, but then we've flown them back at 6 weeks, and they'll be able to show not only did they lose fat and continue to lose fat, but they can sustain that in a free living environment. And that's been a big criticism. Well, yeah, they can do it at True North Health Center where everything is done for them, but what happens when they go back to the real world? And we're able to show that people are able to sustain this, particularly appropriately motivated people. And the best motivation for people, I find, is pain, debility, and fear of death. So people that are sick are usually willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well and exercise and go to bed on time. And also really health conscious people that are, being smart about it, trying to do health promotion, they also do really well. For the people that are looking for magic, this isn't so good. If they want to just keep indulging in short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behavior, they don't want to exercise, they don't want to get enough rest, this isn't for them. This is for highly motivated people that really, above all else, want to avoid the last 20 years of debility that will face most people because they don't live healthily during their younger years.
All right. There's a lot there. So much good stuff. Listen, one of the big takeaways that I got, which is incredibly surprising, I love that you actually looked at this piece and studied it. Where is the fat being mobilized from that the body is breaking down? So it's predominantly coming from our visceral fat, which is well noted to be our most dangerous type of fat associated with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, the list goes on and on, Alzheimer's, but also, so in a lesser ratio of the subcutaneous fat, and also there's a muscle sparing capacity. But the key here is while you're doing the protocol, you're not exercising your face off.
Right. That's unfortunately not where you can exercise. And so when you think about weight loss, you have a couple pounds of glycogen in your muscle. So you've lost 2 pounds of glycogen, and that will come back as you start refeeding. And you have fiber in your intestinal tract. That's going to go way down. Obviously, fasting, you're not going to have active bowel movements once the material that's in the colon is cleared. That you're going to start getting to have normal fiber back in them. You're going to be a little bit dehydrated because there's a physiological dehydration that occurs with fasting as part of the conservation mechanism. So you're going to get your fluid levels back, as you come off the fast. So there's several pounds of weight gain. That has nothing to do with fat. The fat on a whole plant food diet after fasting continues to go down. And that's what's really exciting. Even as the weight goes up, the percentage of body from fat and visceral fat continues to drop. And that continues as long as you keep eating a health-promoting diet. And then, of course, once you add exercise, then you pump back up the labile protein that you may have lost during fasting. You don't lose any muscle cells, but you lose a little bit of the juice out of the muscle, and that comes back after fasting. It takes people about the length of fast refeeding to get back to where they were before fasting. That's very important for athletes that are utilizing fasting, because they have to remember they have to have a recovery period, or it will deplete, they will diminish their performance level. So they have to have adequate recovery after fasting in order to be able to compete effectively.
This is great. My big mission is providing a multifaceted viewpoint of wellness and options for folks who oftentimes, same people coming into my office were people who were told, this is incurable. This is something you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life. You'll never walk again. You've got a certain amount of time to live, and all these different stories. And I want people to know that there's a variety of different voices, and the people that I bring forward for everybody are getting results for their patients, and they're not treating symptoms. They're removing the underlying cause of the disease, and there's many different paths to the goal, but this one can be incredibly powerful. Specifically, let me ask you about this. You mentioned colitis. And this is one of those conditions where for some folks, they have a chronic disease, but it's not as noticeable. It's not as like just a visceral experience. Even if somebody has high blood pressure, for example, they might not even know it. But when you have colitis, it's a constant issue. It can be just something that just keeps on interrupting your life. Same thing with Crohn's. Can you just talk a little bit about any success you've seen with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you have Crohn's or colitis, you may have, as much as 20 bloody bowel movements a day. I mean, it can be a really debilitating condition. It limits people where they can go, what they can do, constant pain, debility, anemia, surgery, and premature death. And what's fascinating to me is that the diet is often not emphasized by conventional gastroenterologists. Some of them are antagonistic that diet may have anything to do with it. I mean, why would you think that what you put in your mouth might have something to do with what comes out the other end? I mean, how ridiculous. And the fact is, there are some food factors that are so profound that many of my patients have already figured it out just by trial and error before we even talk to them. One is dairy products. Dairy products are like gasoline on the fire of inflammation for many colitis patients. Those proteins are just absolutely antagonistic, and people can turn on and off their colitis, sometimes just how much dairy proteins they're putting in their diet. Sometimes just stopping dairy is enough to actually bring the condition under better control. Another is glutinous grains, particularly wheat, rye, barley. These food factors, for people that are sensitive to those, it can be devastating. We know in 1% of the population that have celiac disease, everybody accepts that. But they have trouble understanding that just because your immune system isn't attacking you in the way that it does with celiac doesn't mean it can't be contributing to factors downstream in the colon or with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. The gene, the HLA-DQ gene associated with Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the same gene associated with gluten sensitivity. So if the colon isn't being attacked by the immune system, it may be the thyroid that's being attacked. Lots of different mechanisms by which the body can be compromised by these factors. Sugar itself can be often antagonistic for colitis patients, as is alcohol. Alcohol is nasty, and most colitis patients recognize, if they hold off on the drinking, then they have better control in the bowel. If they do fasting, it's really profound because the gut will heal itself, and then with a carefully controlled diet, you can oftentimes get enough control that the need for medication is eliminated.
So I want to reemphasize this, especially when we're talking about going from, the SAD diet, the standard American diet, or even a healthful diet and still dealing with chronic issues. I want to implore folks to, reach out to your center and to get more information, because we're talking about medically supervised water fasting. And I would love if you could, this is a really important part of this, if you could just give a brief summation of what is the proper way people should be fasting? Like, do you just jump right into it? And also, what do you do after the fast is over? Do you just jump right back to eating food?
Yeah, most important part of fasting is appropriate refeeding. It takes about half the length of a fast to carefully realiment. And in a longer fast, that's very important. It can be very serious, damaging, or even deadly. There's processes called refeeding syndrome, where a person has a very long fast and were to go on to inappropriate refeeding, they can get into really serious trouble. So it's very important if you're going to do fasting. Number one, history exam and lab. Make sure you're a good candidate for fasting. Number two, proper supervision during fasting and appropriate rest, and then careful realimentation. So we usually, for example, will start with fresh fruit or vegetable juices, go to whole fruits and vegetables, steamed and starchy vegetables, and there's a progressive pattern. There's a day per week of fasting for each of these things that we do, so that it takes about half, like a 40-day fast takes about 20 days to fully realiment. A 10-day fast takes about 5 days to recover in a controlled setting. So careful refeeding, probably the most important part of fasting. Appropriate patient selection, the most important part of not screwing people up. And remember that people cannot do water fasting on most medications safely, that there's a profound change in the body that occurs in fasting that would make even medications that they're tolerating feeding not safe fasting, and also that inappropriate withdrawal of medications can be a serious problem. You don't just stop steroids, for example, overnight. You can get serious problems. So it's important to work with a doctor that is familiar with this process, particularly as we get into people that are on medications, have health issues, or doing longer fasting. And one of the things we offer for free to your listeners is, if they're interested in finding out if any of this might be relevant to them, they can go on our website, complete the registration forms, and we offer a no-cost phone conversation with me to talk about, is this relevant? We can refer them to a doctor that perhaps is close to them that might be familiar with this type of work. We have a group of doctors that we've trained over the years that are out there in practice, or they can come to the True North, if it's appropriate, to come to the True North Health Center or one of the other centers that specialize in fasting supervision around the country. We can help put them in contact with those resources. We also have doctors around the country that offer phone coaching, that are through Zoom and through phones, where they can talk to a doctor that's not an idiot, It'll help them engage about, yes, it's possible to get well. These are things they might want to do, or work with their local family physician in helping them through one of these processes. So we do offer some services to help people implement this, because we recognize not everybody has a doctor that's versed with nutrition or fasting or whatever, and some of their physicians are actually antagonistic. They don't think that you should eat a health promoting diet. That's not appropriate. You need, everybody's got to have milk or whatever it is that they believe. And the fact they're wrong doesn't make it any easier on the patients.
Can you share that website for everybody that's listening?
Yeah, our website is truenorthhealth.com.
Okay, perfect.
truenorthhealth.com. Click on the registration forms. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, I love that you said this is something that's occurring more and more, thankfully. Again, I've been in this field for 20 years, but now it's starting to come up as like, don't just get a second opinion. Get a second opinion from somebody who has the same goal as you. Get an opinion from somebody who actually knows it's possible to not need lisinopril or metformin or Celebrex or whatever it is that you're using to treat the symptom that's caused by your lifestyle-related behavior. So I love that so much. Now,
there's one other thing I just would mention. If people really want to get into the weeds with this, we have a book. It's called The Pleasure Trap. And it's readily available from Amazon and all the rest of it. And The Pleasure Trap is a bit of a disturbing book because it tells people what they need to know, not what they want to hear. So it's not going to give you foo-foo, blow smoke up your dress kind of a book. But if you're really serious about understanding it, it goes through and does a good job of explaining the rationale. It talks a lot about fasting and how fasting can be used to help escape the pleasure trap, and about the diet and lifestyle recommendations that we make. So there are resources available.
Perfect. So, okay, we answered the tail end of the question. Now, what about the beginning? What is the proper way people should be fasting?
So everybody should be fasting, in my opinion, 12 to 16 hours every day. Every day. You need to not eat the 3 or 4 hours before you go to sleep at night. Don't be eating right before you go to bed, because that food not only gets stored as fat, but it also tends to disrupt the sleep quality. People believe that if you do some exercise before you eat breakfast in the morning, it actually preferentially mobilizes fat reserves. That may be true. And so you have this period of fasting each and every day, 12 to 16 hours. And then we believe that occasionally appropriately screened patients may benefit from a longer period of fasting, ranging from 5 to 40 days. We recommend that be done in conjunction with their physicians and with the help of doctors that are familiar with fasting, so they don't muck it up. Or come to a place like True North Health, where we'll be happy to do everything for you. We'll supervise you. We'll get you through the process. We can do it affordably.
Perfect. I love that. So let's go back. You kept saying this about exercise and fasting have so many similarities, and you mentioned some of the different things, autophagy, but one of those things that jumped out, BDNF, for example.
Right. BDNF is really exciting, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. They did stuff with rats where they put rats in genetically bred rats, so they're the same. And they put them in cages. They treat everything the same, except they give one rat a wheel where it can exercise. And they will. They will exercise. And they noticed that the rats that exercised didn't get Alzheimer's disease, dementia, rat dementia, which they test by various, maze tricks and stuff. So they didn't get the brain deterioration. They said, why is it the rats that exercise don't get dementia, and the rats that can't exercise because they're in this stupid little cage develop dementia? What is it? What's different? And they found that one difference was something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which protects nerve cells from the damage of free radicals. And we believe that in humans and rats, people that have high BDNF levels have lower likelihood of getting dementia. Maybe one of the reasons why some people get dementia and some people don't. Well, exercise increases BDNF, and so does fasting. Fasting has a profound effect on BDNF, as does exercise. So we want to use fasting to increase BDNF levels, and whether it's 16 hours every day, or whether it's a week, or 2 or 3 or 4 once a year, whatever it's going to be, we believe that the accumulation of those practices may actually help us avoid premature death and disability, increase healthy life expectancy, not just life expectancy, how long you live, but can you avoid the 10 to 20 years of debility that many people experience at the end of their life? Can you live fully functional where you go to sleep one night and don't wake up, a natural death? Or are you going to spend the last 10 years of your life unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed waiting for people to come and change your diaper? We believe the difference may largely be by taking control of what you put in your mouth. So our recommendations are: health results from healthful living. Healthful living involves diet, sleep, and exercise, and periodic fasting, whether it's 12 to 16 hours a day or possibly longer periods of time occasionally. And that we advocate a whole plant food SOS-free diet is what we think is the diet most likely to give you the best chance of not getting debility later in life, slow the aging process, and avoid the refined foods of any kind.
Perfect. I think a lot of people would love to know this. And for example, again, my mother-in-law, every year she does a structured fast herself, even though she's incredibly healthy. What do you do? How often do you fast?
So I fast every year. I fast for a week. If I have no symptoms, then I'm going to break it. Now, I personally don't like fasting because you cannot play basketball. You have to rest. I find it very disruptive to my routine, which may be part of the benefit. So I do that every year. And I believe that the people that get the most benefit of fasting are those healthy people doing it preventatively. I know my mother, when she was 92 years old, she realized she had outlived all of her friends. All 52 of her friends that she'd known over the years were all dead. And now many of them used to make fun of her because of her crazy diet and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, she said she felt very alone because at 92, it's hard to make friends with much younger people. And the people in anywhere around her age group were often debilitated and didn't want to do the things that she wanted to do. And she said, Alan, you need to warn your patients. If they're going to do this diet, make younger friends. So I warn people, start now, make younger, healthier friends so that later you'll still have people you can socialize with.
Oh my goodness, that's words of wisdom right there. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So, I think that, I love that you just said that as something that is supportive of one who's already healthy, already taking on, because I think that a lot of this has been focused on, which it rightfully should be, on the healing of chronic diseases, which is a big part of our population. Right here in the United States, we've got right now at this very time, 242 million adults are overweight or obese. We've got about 50 to 60% of our population has some degree of heart disease. We've got 115 to 130 million folks diabetic, pre-diabetic. We've got a lot of issues that we can solve, but we can also get better. And that's what's so exciting about conversations like this, is like, what are the things that we can add into our superhero utility belt to just make us even better?
I think one of the keys is recognize the pleasure trap, the hidden force that undermines health and happiness. If you really get the message of the pleasure trap, then you are very empowered because you can take responsibility to control your diet, your sleep, your exercise, and fasting, and avoid the diseases rather than have to try to treat them later.
Yeah, I love that. Now, this is something that I touched on a little bit earlier, but it's weird that we're going to put this towards the end of the conversation, but I would love to know, because there's so many benefits here noted. Obviously, we've got so many different peer-reviewed studies on it. You're doing research, you're seeing the success with your patients, but has this been around a long time in medicine? Can you share a little bit of the history of fasting?
Well, fasting, Moses, David, Elijah, Jesus fasted for 40 days, as long as 40 days. I mean, this use of fasting has been back to Hippocrates. I mean, this is not anything we've invented. All we're doing is taking this ancient practice and trying to research it so we can better explain why it works. They've already known it works. It's just a question of what are the mechanisms. And so that's what we're really interested in doing right now with our research, is trying to figure out non-invasive biomarkers so we can better tell who should fast, how long should they fast, when are they done fasting, and what dietary patterns work the best at maintaining health, not just over the short term, but in the long term. And our particular goal is helping people increase healthy life expectancy so they live until they die and not end up becoming debilitated and having to rely on their kids to kind of care for them, but rather remain high degree of functionality right till they reach their genetic potential.
So Hippocrates, the quote father of modern medicine, was employing fasting as a tool.
And way before that, as far back as you can go, you're going to find references to the use of fasting.
Yep, definitely. So I've got a couple final questions for you. And one of them, you mentioned earlier, you said to make sure that you're a good candidate, right? And I would imagine, again, the majority of folks are a good candidate for employing some smart fasting in their life in one form or another. So who would not necessarily be a good candidate? And can we get those folks who aren't in that category to being a good candidate somehow?
Yeah, so the people that have depletion deficiency syndrome, they've got cachexia, they're anorexia nervosa patients, people that have depletion issues, people that are in the end stages of metastatic disease, people that have severe kidney disease, because you need a certain amount of kidney function in order to be able to adapt to the fast. For example, if creatinine levels are over 2.0, we're not normally using water-only fasting. We'll do a modified program just because it would put too much load on those debilitated kidneys. People that are on anticoagulant medications would have to be stabilized off medication first, because you can't just fast on these medications because they get potentiated and create a problem. And if you just withdraw them, then you're at potential risk of stroke or having other problems. So it's really important that medications be appropriately managed, withdrawn, and be done appropriately in order to ensure that this is effective. People that have dysrhythmia issues that require anticoagulant therapy, because the anticoagulant therapy contraindicates fasting, would have to be managed with an alternative approach. But I might mention that some of the intermittent fasting approaches where they're using limited calorie intake can be done in conjunction with medication, so long as the physician is familiar with how to modify the drugs. So, those are some of the more common issues. Probably the biggest contraindication of fasting is fear. Fear is a very expensive emotion, so it's important people be educated to understand that this is an adaptive mechanism that the body had to have in order for our species to survive. Right now, though, people are so afraid of fasting. If they get on a plane to New York and they fly to California, they're pretty sure they'll die over Colorado if they don't eat the peanuts. They think the pretzels saved their life because, 5 hours would be, more than what their body could adapt to. Once they've seen that fasting works, once they've experienced it, they realize their body's ability to fast is a biological adaptation. All the humans that couldn't fast died in our ancestry. They had to be able to survive because spring would come late. And with this big bulbous neuronal net we have, our brain that's our biggest burner of glucose, if you didn't have the ability to change your brain from burning sugar to burning fat, you wouldn't be able to live any longer than the chimps can. And that's why you'll always find chimps hanging out in the tropics where there's a ready supply of fruit all year long, because their brain doesn't change to burning fat. It stays burning glucose. They can't fast like we can. Humans are really special because we had such a big brain. We had to have the ability to do this, and all the people that didn't have that ability are dead. Your ancestors, the ones that got enough to eat, didn't get eaten, lived long enough to reproduce, and passed on their genes. Your brain is the same genes as a human 100,000 years ago. The only thing that's really changed is our environment. We changed the environment with our innovation. And now we have access to highly processed fractionated foods. And that's why we have 2/3 of our population, as you said, being overweight or obese. Because they're exposed to these chemicals. We're addicts. We've become addicted to the pleasure trap cycle, and we've got to get out of it. Some people can get out on their own. Some people need help. Some people need to use fasting to escape the pleasure trap.
This has been incredibly enlightening, and thank you so much for sharing your brilliance. I got one final question for you, and it's just so apparent in having this conversation. What makes you so passionate about this? What's getting you up every day and working with patients and just inspiring you to do this work in the way that you're doing it?
Well, my wife says that the reason we made up the True North Health Center was so that I'd have a place to eat, and that the reason I'm doing this work is because I want to prove I'm right and everybody else is wrong. So she might be right. We've been married for 38 years, so
She's
whatever
right.
she says, I know the secret to a successful marriage. I know those 2 magic words. Yes, dear.
That's right. Legendary. Well, listen, this has been fantastic, and I appreciate you so much. So again, can you share where folks can get more information and also the name of your book and where they can pick it up again?
Well, they can get The Pleasure Trap anywhere, at Amazon or any bookstore. They can get to us for a free phone conversation by going to truenorthhealth.com and completing the registration forms. And I'll look forward to speaking with them.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
Why do we separate disease from aging? The only difference is because aging happens to more than 50% of us. And that's a crazy distinction. I would say that that's even more important, that we focus research, development, policy on actually what kills most of us.